Hi and welcome to Survey Design Essentials. I'm Catrin, I'm a Senior Consultant here at Nimble Approach. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to know what question to use. There's so many different types of questions, and it's really important to know what type of question it is that's best to use to get the answers that you need. So here are the question types that I will be going through. There are so many more than this, and these are just the most common ones that I'll be covering. So you've got pre-coded lists, you've got yes/no questions, classifications or demographics, rankings, Likert scales and matrices, open-ended questions. So to start off, pre-coded lists. So this is an example of a pre-coded list. You've got a list of things and then they can select one or multiple from that list. So they are really good if there is a finite number of possible responses. And when I say finite as well, I mean not 50 different things. That's just too long to give them a list. But they're really good and they're quick for the user to complete. They can just select what they need to and carry on. They're really good for standardized results. Think about a graph and you can then measure depending on what answer they give. You will have a limited number of choices. That's more of a con. You want to keep it, I'd say, depending on what type of it is, below, say, 10 or 15. And there is no way of knowing if the user understood the question with this. What they might have done is just clicked an answer to continue. But that's just a risk that you're going to be taking. You just want to make it as clear as possible to try and limit that risk. The next one is a yes/no question. So really simply, it's a question where you've got yes and no. You can give others then things like I'd rather not say, I'm not sure, to give them that opt out. But it's usually yes, no are in there somewhere. So it's really good because it's even quicker for the user to complete. There's going to be 4, maybe tops answers. It's a really good for a branching question. And when I say branching question, I mean if somebody says yes to a question, you can then follow up with a different question and you can ask for a bit more information. But if they say no, you can then skip that user in the journey so they're not seeing questions that are irrelevant to them. Really good branching questions, yes, no's. There's no way of knowing if the user understood the question. Again, they might just click something to continue, but this is where you can add in I'd rather not say, I'm not sure. So that way you've got that idea of if they're trying to skip it and they're not just answering and biasing your results a little bit. Next one is classifications and demographics. So again, really simple. This is just similar to a pre-coded list, but it's a bit more specific because it's got more of a preset. It's not one you've set yourself. It's got a very standard list. So it's really good when the answer will be really clear to users. So like the question before, it's where they live, it's going to be really clear. Again, it's really quick because they can click an answer and continue. Again, it's good for branching questions. It's really good for things like screeners as well. If you want people that are in a certain role, in a certain age bracket, a certain gender, those things, you can use them to screen them out. Again, there is no way of knowing if the user really understood the question, but there's ways to limit that risk. Rankings. So this is where you want to give them a list of things and you want them to rank it to the best to worst or easiest to most difficult, things like those. So it's really good to understand feelings and opinions for something. If you've got lots of different projects and on the backlog and you think I'm not sure which problem to solve first, it's really good for prioritising for them because you can see actually which things are coming up as the most problematic. The problem with these is the more choices you put in, the less reliable the results. If you think about somebody's given you a long list and you're trying to prioritise, it gets a bit blurry. But if you've only got a couple of things in there, it's more easy then to say, yes, this is better than this. It can take longer for the user to answer the question. This is because they've just got to think about it more rather than selecting something and moving on. They might submit it in the existing order. So this might be because the order that it's already in is what they wanted it to be. But other ones, they might just try and skip it by just going with whatever's already there. This is where you want to try and make things as less biased as possible, things like sorting alphabetically. with those kind of things as well, sometimes some survey software, they will kind of let you know if the user's just skipped it or if they have moved something and then kind of submitted it that way. Also, depending on the survey software you're using, it might not be accessible to all users. Something to really think about when you're kind of creating a survey is making sure it is accessible. Likert scales and matrices. So you've probably seen these before. So it's a scale. You're giving them a scale, and one is one value, say 5, 7, whatever is the opposite value, and you're asking them to rate their something. With this one, I've got rate their experience. The difference between a Likert scale and a matrix, a Likert scale is one question. A matrix will be kind of more of a grid where you've got lots of questions and they're ranking all those questions on that same scale. So it's really good to get a profile of the users. So it's really good for gathering feedback, things like opinions and feelings about things as well. You can then choose to either give the user a neutral answer, so kind of like in the middle. So it's 1 to 5, they've got kind of an okay in the middle. Or you can give them an even number, and that'll force them to be more positive, more negative. Depending on what you're doing as well, you can add I'm not sure, I don't know to the end, so that they can opt out then rather than kind of being forced to choose something. The biggest problem with these and any that kind of gauge feelings is they're not reliable, especially when there's lots of options. If you think about 2 people, they might feel exactly the same about something, but actually they're going to put different things based on their own confidence levels on the scale. So it might be that 2 people have selected, very difficult, but one might have had a much worse experience, and that same person would have ranked the other person's experience maybe as just difficult. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind especially when you're analysing these results. Lastly, you've just got open-ended questions. Really simple. It's just a free text where they can put anything they want in there. So this is really good to get more detailed insights. So it's really good at the end of a survey. I always put an open-ended question at the end of a survey. This is to capture any feedback that either you wouldn't have thought of when you were creating the survey, or for them to just kind of let you know about something. If you're doing any kind of analysis as well, where you're kind of feeding back survey results, you can get quotes from these kind of things as well. Obviously, with these kind of open-ended, depending on how much they write, it may take much longer to answer. They might not even answer it because they can't be bothered with typing in a lot of information. Analysis for you as well will absolutely take longer. It's not a standardized thing. You're going to have to read through, and especially if everyone's putting big paragraphs, it's going to take a long time to read through all of that and analyse it. It's really important as well to say this is not to replace qualitative research. You can't just ask open-ended questions to try and get the answers you need. There's no way of knowing if they understood the question, things like that. It's just really good to maybe capture something else. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Those kind of things. And some extra hints and tips for these. So all questions should be optional if possible. So it's not always possible. Sometimes you want to force somebody to answer a question. That's fine. Just instead of having them all mandatory by default, make them all optional by default, and then choose which ones you want to make mandatory. Things like branching questions would need to be mandatory. Give them an opt-out if they need to, but then it kind of determines which path that user is going to take. Give them an opt-out. I always try and give them an opt-out. I'm not sure, I don't know. Even for optional questions. The reason for this is because they will then either skip the question if they want to skip it, but if they've actually read the question and they're genuinely unsure, they can tell you that they're not sure, and it gives you a little bit more information about kind of the type of user. They might not have understood the question. It gives you more information there. Try and test your questions. I've said to test them with subject matter experts. We know that's not always possible in the real world, but if possible, test them. Worst case scenario, just test with anyone. Any listing options, try and add them in a neutral way. So this is to avoid any bias. So if it's just a random list of things that you want them to rank, put them alphabetically. If it's something that's got kind of a set order, like colours of the rainbow, you might want to set, the question in the order of the colours of the rainbow, but just try and make it into a neutral way. You need to make sure any rankings or scales are really clear. The last thing you want is somebody to think one is good when actually one is really bad, and then you've got upside down results. You're not going to know from analysing if the results are upside down. It might come out as kind of looking a bit silly compared to the others, but if you make sure everything's really clear, then you won't have that problem. And make sure any scales are balanced as well. They need to be balanced, otherwise you're adding bias in there. The other options need to be really clearly differentiated as well. So you can't say a little difficult, somewhat difficult. What's the difference? Which one's worse? You need to make sure they are very clearly differentiated. And for this, you need the same amount of positive as you have the negative, and try and have the same wording. It's like very, you've got very at each end. Things like that. It's really good practice to start with quick and easy questions. This gets the user opted in. They're going, oh, this is nice and easy, and kind of go through that way. If they've invested more time, they're less likely to drop out. It's not saying they're not going to, but they're less likely because they think they're nearly towards the end. If you front load with a load of open-ended questions, it might put them off straight away and they're going to opt out. It might not make sense to do it this way. You might want to kind of follow the process of something, say kind of their journey in a service. So it might be more sensible to kind of go through that process. Just try and make it as easy as possible. Don't try and ask a lot of hard-hitting questions, like the really long ones right at the beginning if possible. And please don't use a survey for a sensitive topic, things like, domestic violence. It's going to cause some really raw emotions doing that, and you're not going to be there to support the user. If it's anything sensitive, it's better to just speak to people and have that one-to-one conversation, or even just not bother unless you really have to. But don't use it for a sensitive topic unless you really have to. So what does good look like? This is kind of what I use when I'm reviewing questions. I make sure they meet each of these things. So it'll meet all of these points. It will avoid bias as much as possible. If you think about kind of a yes/no question, you can follow up and kind of, you're already making that assumption because they've already told you. But you can't ask that kind of question about their experience until you know if they've done it. Otherwise, you're making an assumption. They need to be relevant to the user. If they don't understand, they might just end up skipping through. If they've skipped through too many questions, it's more likely then that they're going to drop out as well. It needs to relate back to your survey goals. So if you think about the question at the beginning, where you kind of wanted to know what question you're trying to answer, does it meet that kind of information? It's really good for cutting down questions if you need to as well. If you've got kind of only a few questions and you're adding something in for another team, as long as it's kind of relevant to the user, that should be absolutely fine. It needs to be easy to understand. If it's not easy to understand, it could really bias your findings. It might not make sense to the user. You're going to get questions and answers all over the shop. So really try and make it as easy as possible to understand. Again, and being clear in its meaning, especially things like scales that I was mentioning before, it needs to be really clear in exactly what you're trying to find out. It needs to only ask one thing. The last thing you want to do is kind of ask, for example, how quick and easy something was. Well, it might have been really easy to do, but it might have actually taken a long time. So how does that user answer that question then? Do they say, put it somewhere neutral? Do they say, yes? But then it's not really a true reflective. You want to split things out, so it's only asking one thing per question. So making sure questions are balanced. This is an example of really unbalanced questions. You're making assumptions. How important, how good, do you agree? So you're making assumptions. There are some things here that you can use as a follow-up question. So If you've kind of asked them to say, is something important? And they say yes, then you can ask how important. You're not making an assumption. They've already told you that, but you can't use these as standalone. These are balanced questions. So what extent do you agree or disagree? How good or poor? A lot of surveys you might see, and this is a media trick as well for kind of big brands, sometimes they will say, to what extent do you agree? They are trying to add bias in then to try and put that thing in that you already agree. So it's already in your brain that you agree. If you want true findings, you want to say agree or disagree. It might make it a little bit more wordy, and you might get some pushback on this. The best way to push back again is to flip it round. If someone says, to what extent do you agree? We'll say, well, why don't we put it as to what extent do you disagree? It'll change something in their head, and then they'll think, oh yeah, we don't want to put it that way. That sounds negative. Well, you want it to be balanced. Thank you for coming to my talk about survey design essentials, what questions to ask.